I remember the pure ecstasy I felt the moment I opened the envelope and discovered that I had won an all-expenses-paid cruise. I had never won anything in my life, so I was overjoyed to win something so incredible. At the time, I didn't even think about the fact that I didn't remember entering any competition. I had been extremely depressed lately, and this was the perfect pick-me-up. The big day arrived, and I stood on the quay, gazing at the gigantic cruise ship, and was in awe of its beauty. It had a weird name, something like Charon, which seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I knew it from. I made my way to the gangway and handed over my ticket to the crew member standing watch. He didn't even gaze at it before waving me to climb aboard. I was pretty much on cloud 9 when I finally took my first steps on the boat. I was standing there with the biggest smile on my face when a guy came running up to me and screamed, "What's up?" right in my face. I started to laugh, as I hadn't heard anyone say that phrase in almost 20 years. The laughter died in my throat, and I gazed into his face. He had an unhinged, manic look that made me take a few steps back until I bumped into the railing. His eyes were completely bloodshot, and I couldn't see any trace of white in his eyeballs. He once again screamed "What's up?" before rushing off. I stood there, shaken, for a few minutes, as I didn't know what else to do. I was roused from my thoughts when the ship's horn blared and we started moving. I gazed around in confusion, as no one else had climbed aboard since I had embarked. I decided to just find my cabin and put away my luggage so that I could do some exploring. I started to get uneasy as I made my way to a cabin, as I didn't see anybody else. I was relieved when I found my cabin and immediately unloaded my luggage and changed into something more comfortable. I checked myself in the mirror and grimaced as I saw a few grey hairs were now starting to show. I opened the door to my cabin and walked outside, with the plan to find the nearest bar. I could hear voices in the distance and began making my way toward them. I was turning a corner when I saw the same guy from earlier, standing on top of the railway. He must have heard me because he turned around and locked eyes with me. He half-heartedly said "What's up?" before jumping overboard. I rushed forward and looked over the railing, but I couldn't see his body. I saw a few sharks circling behind the ship, and I knew they had probably killed him. My legs felt like lead as I gazed behind the ship. The sharks were following us, as if they were waiting for more food. I decided the best course of action was to find a crew member and explain to them what had happened. The voices I had heard from earlier were growing louder, and I finally discovered the source, which appeared to be a ballroom. I pushed open the doors and moved inside. The room instantly went quiet, and dozens of eyes were now locked on me. I felt a shiver go down my spine as I looked around at everyone. They all had the same manic look on their faces, and their clothes were all mixed and matched from different time periods. The conversations once again started, as my novelty quickly ended. I tried to talk to people, but they would just shush me and then continue talking. I was about to give up hope when an old woman waved me over. She was using a knife to clean dirt from between her nails and reminded me of my great-aunt Gladys. Her face was covered in wrinkles, and she looked like she had been beautiful a long time ago. She gave me a warm smile and ushered me to sit down. She asked me how long I had been on board, and grimaced when I said I had arrived today. I laughed when she said that she has been on board since 1945. The serious look on her face made me stop laughing. She reached over and squeezed my hand, and told me that there is no escaping this ship. I was sitting there in shock at what she said when she grabbed my hand and then used the knife to slice off 2 of my fingers. I began screaming in agony while she picked up the fingers and threw them in her mouth. She opened her mouth a minute later, and I saw my fingers were gone. She started to stand up, and I jumped away. Everyone else in the room was watching us now, and I could see that some of their gazes were fixated on my blood-soaked hand. They were licking their lips, and some began to stand up. I ran towards the doors that I had entered and rushed out before slamming the door behind me. I placed all my weight against it as someone from inside was now trying to get out. They gave up after a few moments, but I didn't move, in case it was just a ploy to get me to move. When I was sure that it was safe, I began to make my way back to my cabin. On the way, I saw 2 children running towards me, and I screamed when I finally got a good look at their faces. It looked like someone had peeled the skin off, piece by piece, and you could now see parts of their skull poking through. They rushed by me while giggling and didn't even give me a second glance. I began to run and rushed inside my cabin, locking the door behind me. My room had been trashed while I was away, and a lot of my clothes were missing. I grabbed a shirt and wrapped it around my bleeding fingers in the hopes of stemming the flow of blood. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember is waking up on the cabin floor. I looked down at my hand and was relieved to see the bleeding had stopped. I peered out the door and saw a fire axe down the hallway. I grabbed the axe, as it might protect me from the other passengers. I started searching the ship, but couldn't find any crew members. I ducked into cover any time I heard any passengers coming. I was about to give up searching when I heard a familiar voice ahead of me. I tiptoed forward and spotted the woman who had eaten my fingers. She was bent over something while talking to a man who was standing beside her. She stood up suddenly, and I quickly moved back around the corner before they could spot me. Their voices began to move away, and I waited until I could no longer hear them before moving again. I walked over to see what the woman had been doing. I almost vomited as I uncovered the macabre scene. The 2 children from yesterday lay face down on the floor, with their skulls crushed in, and a large chunk of their brain was now missing. I fell to the ground when they jumped up and looked down at me before running off. I started hyperventilating as I couldn't comprehend what I had just witnessed. I spent the next few days going over every inch of the ship that I could safely explore. I ran into a few other passengers throughout this time and had to flee from them as they hungrily advanced on me. I had to use an axe to crush in one of their skulls, and yet somehow he walked away with the axe still embedded in his skull. I made one sickening discovery during this time, which gives me chills even to remember. I had been searching some of the nearby cabins that were close to my own. I walked into one of them to find a skeleton lying on the bed. All of the skin and muscles had already rotted away. I grabbed a nearby blanket to cover the body when the skeleton turned its head and begged me to kill it. I ran out of the cabin so fast that I probably set a new land speed record. Yesterday, we pulled into a port, and I grabbed my stuff with the intentions of disembarking. I reached the gangway and regarded it as my salvation. The quay looked deserted, and there seemed to be only the one crew member standing at the bottom. I placed my foot on the gangway and began to move forward. I immediately became disoriented and felt something latch onto my leg. I froze in terror as I looked down at an endless black abyss filled with thousands of rotting corpses. Many of them were somehow making their way towards me. One of them had a grip on my ankle and was pulling me downwards to join the others. I lashed out with my other leg and kicked them repeatedly until they let go. I fell backwards onto the deck of the ship, with a rotting hand still attached to my leg. I quickly wrenched it free and lobbed it overboard. I stood up and stared at the gangway as it looked completely normal once again. A family of 4 walked up the gangway, and the parents were giving me concerned looks as they moved past me. One of their children kept glancing back at me as they moved away. I wished that I had warned them not to come on board. But it's too late now. The next day, I was making my way along in the hopes of finding something to eat. I stopped dead in my tracks as I spotted the head of the child from yesterday. Her body was nowhere to be seen, and there were bloody stains on the floor, which makes me think someone had dragged it away. She suddenly opened her eyes and asked me to help her find her mummy and daddy. I picked up her head and told her I would help as best as I could. I dropped her over the railing and hoped that this will help release her from this ship. The sharks instantly devoured her, and I felt a tear running down my cheek. I now stand beside the railing, looking back at the sharks and wondering if the "what's up" guy had made the right choice. I'm beginning to wonder if I will be brave enough to make the same choice as him, to escape this cruise from hell. Hello, sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.